and welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new here, and I would love to welcome all my new subscribers who have subscribed to me this week. Thank you guys so much. It's lovely to have some new people here and lovely to have my constant subscribers that have been with me right from the start, always coming back week after week. It's lovely to see you all. So today we have something special, and it marks the start of a little series that I would like to do because it's a little bit more fun and not quite as dark as some of the other real crime down unders that I present. And today marks the beginning of our Bush Rangers specials, special edition Bush Ranger episodes. And of course today, as promised last week, we are starting with the immortal Ned Kelly. And I do have to apologise that my video this week is a couple of days late. Unfortunately though, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, life happens in between videos, and as you guys know, as I told you last week, we're getting ready for Bianca's wedding in October, so we had wedding stuff to do, and then I had family stuff to do yesterday, so today is the day for Mr. Kelly. And I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this. If you don't know much about Ned Kelly, this will tell you everything you need to know. I think it'll be fun for our overseas subscribers as well, learning all about Ned Kelly. Some of you may not even know who he is. So whether he is to you a hero, an outlaw, whatever he is, sit back and enjoy this new series of the Bush Rangers. So we're going to start with Ned, as I said, and I'm just going to tell you all about him. And I do urge you to grab your real crime coffee or tea or whatever it is you drink. Also grab a snack. If you're in a cooler climate as we are at the moment, grab a blanket, your comfiest clothes, and get comfortable, because there is so much information on our dear Mr. Kelly that it's going to be a long video, so I hope you guys enjoy it. And let's get started with the immortal Ned Kelly. So, born Edward Kelly in December of 1854, he was an Australian bushranger, outlaw, gang leader, and also a convicted police murderer. One of the last bushrangers, he is known for wearing a suit of bulletproof armour during his final shootout with the police. So Ned was born in the then British colony of Victoria as the third of 8 children to his Irish parents. His father, a transported convict, died shortly after serving a 6-month prison sentence, leaving Kelly, then aged 12, as the eldest male of the household. The Kellys were a poor selector family who saw themselves as downtrodden by the squatterocracy, as victims of persecution by the Victorian police. So this will tell you right there how far police corruption in Australia goes back. And this is essentially what got the Kelly gang started, because it wasn't just Ned on his own. He had his brothers with him and several friends, and they were known as the Kelly gang. And I'll get into that. I don't want to spoil the story. But yeah, the police corruption, oh my goodness, it goes back even further than I had contemplated with all the research I've been doing lately. So I found this part really, really interesting. And the Kelly family were harassed by the police quite a bit back then. So while a teenager, Kelly was arrested for associating with bushranger Harry Power and served 2 prison terms for a variety of offences. And I will cover Harry Power in another bushranger edition. The longest stretch being from 1871 to 1874 on conviction of receiving a stolen horse. He later joined the Greta mob, a group of bush larrikins known for stock theft. Soon after this, a violent confrontation with a policeman occurred at the Kelly family home in 1878, and Kelly was indicted for the attempted murder of the officer. However, after this, Ned would flee to the bush, and he vowed to avenge his mother, who actually was imprisoned for her role in the incident. After he and his younger brother Dan and 2 associates, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart, shot dead the 3 policemen, and the government of Victoria proclaimed them as outlaws. And I guess that the policemen were dead, and Ned and his brothers and his friends have taken off. They didn't actually have a chance to tell their side of the story, which, as it comes out later on, the family was being harassed by the police. So they've taken off. The mother's been imprisoned. Obviously, she wasn't going to talk. So that is how the whole outlaw thing got started. So Ned and his gang eluded the police for a whole 2 years, thanks in part to the support of an extensive network of sympathisers. The gang's crime spree included raids on Euroa and Jerilderie, and you might recognise Jerilderie from a former video of mine. At the moment, I can't remember which one, but I know Jerilderie played a part in one. I think it might have been the Mackay murder, Donald Bruce Mackay. I think Jerilderie played a part in that, but I'm not sure. The gang's crime spree, as I said, included the raids on Euroa and Jerilderie and the killing of Aaron Sherritt, a sympathiser who turned police informant. And there has been very many movies made about the life of Ned Kelly, including one forgettable and regrettable starring Mick Jagger, but he did an amazing job as Ned Kelly. He was quite funny. But the best depiction of Ned Kelly's life, if you can get your hands on it, was when Heath Ledger played him. And I think the movie's just called Ned Kelly, of course. And it goes into this in further detail of the friend who turned police informant and what happened there. So I would encourage you all to see if you can get your hands on the movie and watch it. It's a great depiction of Ned and of the family and of his brothers and everything. And Heath Ledger played him brilliantly. And I loved Heath Ledger. I was so devastated when he passed away. But it is a brilliant movie, so I can highly recommend. In a manifesto letter, Kelly, denouncing the police, the Victorian government and the British Empire, set down his own accounts of the events leading up to his I can't even pronounce this word. I'm just going to say his outlaw days, demanding justice for his family and the rural poor. He threatened dire consequences against those who defied him. So in a sense, he almost got a Robin Hood-like hero aura around him for the people that he was actually trying to help. So it was almost like a Robin Hood thing, and I think this is what just gave him his legendary status. In 1880, when his attempt to derail and ambush a police train failed, he and his gang, dressed in armour fashioned from stolen from plough mouldboards, engaged in a final gun battle with the police at Glenrowan, and it would later become known as the Glenrowan Siege. Kelly, the only survivor, was severely wounded by police despite his armour, and he was finally captured. Despite thousands of supporters attending rallies and signing a petition for his reprieve, Kelly was tried, convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out at the old Melbourne jail. Historian Geoffrey Searle would go on to call Kelly and his gang the last expression of the lawless frontier and what was becoming a highly organised and educated society. The last protest of the mighty bush, now tethered with iron rails to Melbourne and the world. In the century after his death, Kelly became a cultural icon, inspiring numerous works in art and popular culture, and is the subject of more biographies than any other Australian. So as I said before, everybody loves our beloved Ned Kelly. Kelly continues to cause division in Australia, however. Some celebrate him as Australia's equivalent of Robin Hood, as I said before, while others regard him as a murderous villain, undeserving of his folk hero status. Another journalist, Martin Flanagan, would write, "What makes a legend is not that everyone sees him the same. It's that everyone sees him. Like a bushfire on the horizon casting its red glow into the night." So now we're going to move on to a little bit more about Ned's early years with his family, because I think this is really interesting and it just helps you to get to know our beloved Ned just a little bit better. Ned Kelly's father, John Kelly, known as Red, was born in 1820 at Clonbrogan near Moyglaz in County Tipperary in Ireland. And I'm also of Irish descent. On my mother's side of the family, my family actually came from Wexford, County Wexford in Ireland before they moved here to Australia. So anything to do with Ireland always means a lot to me. So this is another reason why I kind of love Ned Kelly and his family so much. At the age of 21, he was found guilty of stealing 2 pigs and was transported on the prison ship Prince Regent, arriving at Hobart Town, Van Diemen's Land. Van Diemen's Land is now what's known as Hobart in the state of Tasmania. It was like one of the first penal colonies. On the 2nd of January 1842 is when he arrived. After finishing his sentence in January of 1848, Red moved to the colony of Victoria and found work at James Quinn's farm at Wallen Wallen as a bush carpenter. On the 18th of November 1850, Red married Ellen Quinn, his employer's 18-year-old daughter, at St Francis Church. The Honourable Father Gerard Ward officiating. The couple subsequently turned their attention to gold digging and earned enough to buy a small freehold in Beveridge, just north of Melbourne. And gold digging back then meant different things than it does today. She's the only example I have, don't come for me. It meant they were actually digging for gold. At age 11, Kelly saved a young boy from drowning in a creek and was awarded the Green Sash in recognition of his bravery. Kelly wore the sash under his armour during his last stand at Glenrowan. It remains stained with his blood. Edward Ned Kelly was his parents' 3rd child. The exact date of his birth is not known, but as we covered before, it was probably in December of 1854 or thereabouts. Ned was possibly baptised by an Augustinian priest, Charles O'Hay, who also administered the last rites before his execution. And wow, that this was a fact that I didn't know about until I did this research. Can you imagine what that would have been like for the priest or whatever, the father, whatever they called him back then, that you officiate at this youngster's christening as a baby and then, or baptism, whatever they wanted to call it back then, and then you're giving him his last rites before he's about to become executed. So yeah, that's another one of these things. I know I say that a lot of my videos, but when it comes to these things, it's very hard to imagine the emotions. Like, I think it would have been like a war of emotions that you knew this boy when he was a baby and now you're giving him his last rites. So I think that would have been pretty sad for him. So Ned's parents had 7 other children. There was a daughter named Mary Jane who was born in 1851 but died as an infant aged 6 months. There was another sister named Annie, born in 1853, Margaret, born in 1857, James, also known as Jim, born in 1859, Daniel, born in 1861, Catherine, born in 1863, and Grace, born in 1865. And they all lived into the 1940s, so they had a good innings, unlike poor Ned. Ned Kelly's family did not prosper at Beveridge, and his father began drinking heavily. In 1864, the family moved to Avenel near Seymour, where they soon attracted the attention of the local police. As a boy, Kelly obtained basic schooling and became familiar with the bush. At Avenel, he risked his life to save another boy from drowning in Hughes Creek, as we touched on briefly before. And that was when the boy's family gave him the green sash. In 1865, Red was convicted in relation to the theft of a calf and sentenced to a fine of £25 or 6 months hard labour. Although the family could not afford to pay the fine, there is no record of Red being transferred to the Kilmore jail. In December 1866, Red was fined for being drunk and disorderly. Badly affected by alcoholism, he died at Avenel on the 27th of September 1866. The following year, the Kelly family would move to Greta in northeastern Victoria near the Quinns and their relatives by marriage, the Lloyds. In 1868, Ned's uncle Jim Kelly was convicted of arson after setting fire to the rented premises where the Kellys and some of the Lloyds were staying. And it doesn't actually say why he did that. I mean, he was Ned Kelly's uncle, so why would he set fire to his a place where his family was staying? I find that a little bit strange, but this is another one I tried going down a rabbit hole for and I couldn't find the rabbit hole. So nobody knows why he did it, but Jim was sentenced to death, and this was later commuted to 15 years of hard labour instead. So Jim got off pretty lightly compared to what Ned ended up with. So after this, the family would soon lease a small farm of 88 hectares, which is 360,000 miles squared, and this was at 11 Mile Creek near Greta. The Kelly selection was probably unsuitable for farming, and Ellen supplemented her income by offering accommodation to travellers and illegally selling alcohol. So honestly, I think the family was just doing what it had to get by, but I think it gave them a pretty bad reputation. So now we move on to Ned and his rise to a notoriety or infamy or fame, however you want to look at it. So he was bushranging with Harry Power, and Harry Power has been described as becoming Ned's bushranging mentor. So when Power was captured, Kelly was accused of informing on the bushranger. In 1869, 14-year-old Kelly met the Irish-born Harry Power, who also had an alias of Harry Johnson, a transported convict who turned to bushranging in northeastern Victoria after escaping Melbourne's Pentridge prison. And wow, because our case that we covered a couple of weeks ago was also Pentridge prison, and they escaped. And I'm pretty sure I've covered a couple of other escapes from Pentridge prison. So it seems to me like Pentridge prison security wasn't very good if all these people are escaping. So, I mean, it's bad that these people are escaping, but I can't help having a bit of a giggle that Pentridge keeps coming up as a place that people keep escaping from. And especially all the way back in Ned Kelly's day. It's I think it's quite funny. So the Kellys formed part of Powers' network of sympathisers, and by May 1869, Ned had become his bushranging protege. At the end of the month, they attempted to steal horses from the Mansfield property of a squatter named John Rowe, as part of a plan to rob the Woods Point Mansfield Gold Escort. They abandoned the idea and fled back into the bush after Rowe shot at them, and Kelly temporarily broke his association with Power. And I think for a young boy, if he was like only 14, 15 years old, you know, getting shot at's a pretty big thing. I mean, you could die. So I can see why Kelly was sort of like, okay, this isn't for me. I don't want to go with this guy. But obviously they link back up at some point. So Kelly's first brush with the law occurred in mid-October 1869 over an altercation between him. And I don't know... Oh, wow, I forgot about this part. Oh no, you'll see why I'm laughing so hard at the moment. This is really funny. I don't know how I'm going to say this dude's name without getting myself into trouble. I might just have to spell the last name, and you can draw your own conclusions as to how it's pronounced. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, and I know that's what you're thinking, you'd be right. Okay, so let's just get back to this. If I can stop laughing. Kelly's first brush with the law occurred in mid-October 1869 over an altercation between a Chinese pig and fowl dealer from Morses Creek, and I swear to you this is true, named F-O-O-K. I'm just going to say it. I hope I don't get in trouble. Fook. That was his name. I swear to God. That's why I can't stop laughing about it. And the fact that Kelly was Irish, it would just totally sound like he was saying, fuck. Oh, I need to get over my merriment at this. According to Fook, as he passed the Kellys' family home, Ned brandishing a long stick, and came out to Fook, declaring himself as a bushranger before robbing him of 10 shillings. Kelly gave evidence in court that Fook had abused his sister Annie in a dispute over Fook's request for a drink of water. Okay, that's not quite so funny. Fook then beat Ned with a stick after he came to his sister's defence. Annie and 2 family-related witnesses corroborated Ned's story, and the charge at that time was dismissed. But just the fact of the guy's name. That's too funny. I'm sorry, it is. So, following this, Kelly reconciled with Power in the March of 1870, and over the next month, the pair committed a series of armed robberies as police scrambled to find them and identify Powers' young accomplice. And you might even call him an apprentice at this time. By the end of April, the press had named Kelly as the culprit, and a few days later, he was actually captured by police and confined to Beechworth Jail. Kelly fronted court on 3 separate charges of robbery, the first 2 of which were dismissed as none of the victims could positively identify him. On the 3rd charge, the victims also reportedly failed to identify Ned, but they were in fact refused the chance by Superintendents Nicholas and Hare. Instead, Nicholas told the magistrate that Kelly fitted the description and asked for him to be remanded for trial. Kelly was sent to Melbourne, where he spent the weekend in a lockup before being transferred to Kyneton to face the court. No evidence was produced in the court, and Ned was released after only a month in jail. However, as history has turned over time, historians do tend to disagree over this episode. Some see it as evidence of police harassment. Others believe the Kelly family intimidated witnesses, making them reluctant to give evidence. Another factor in the lack of identification may have been that the witnesses had described Powers' accomplice as, and I apologise to anybody of a mixed race who is watching this. This is not my words. This is in the history, a half-caste. And back then, that was known as a person of Aboriginal and European descent. I don't agree with that terminology, but this is just in the history, so please don't come for me. However, police believed this to be the result just of Kelly going unwashed. And you have to think back then, they wouldn't have had like a nice hot shower or anything like we have then. They were living in the bush. They were obviously living quite poorly. And they probably just went down to the local creek or something for a wash every now and then. And in summer, that would have been great. You could go and cool off. But as you know, Victoria is a very, very cold place. It actually snows there in some parts during the winter, and it would have been extremely cold, especially back then, because we wouldn't have had climate change and all the rest of the things happening. And I think it would have been hard for Kelly. I'm going to stop there just for a second and just wax paranormal. I often see orbs and things floating around when I'm doing my videos, and I haven't commented on it before, but if anybody else catches anything flying through my videos, can you please let me know, because I'll be interested to see if anybody else actually notices them. I've just noticed it go across there then. So I find that interesting, especially when I'm doing historical cases, that I have things show up on camera and it does catch my eye. And my house, I wouldn't say it's haunted, but it is inhabited by the owners, the old couple that used to live here before we bought the place. And consequently, as their children have passed, they are also here in the house with us. Their pets are also here as well. So I have a lot going on in this house. So if there's an orb or something floating around that you catch, it's one of them. It's nothing nasty, I promise. But I just think it's funny how they really turn up when I start talking about historical stuff. Anyway, on with the story. So the bush ranger Power often camped at the Glenmore Station, a large property owned by Kelly's maternal grandfather James Quinn, which sat at the headwaters of the King River. In June 1870, while resting in a mountainside gunya, which is also known as a bark shelter, that overlooked the property, Power was captured by a police search party. Following his arrest, word spread within the community that Kelly had informed on him. Kelly denied the rumour, and in a letter that bears the only surviving example of Ned Kelly's handwriting, he pleads with Sergeant James Babington of Kyneton for help, saying, "Everyone looks on me like a black snake." The informant turned out to be Kelly's uncle Jack Lloyd, who received £5,000 for his assistance. However, Kelly had also given information which led to Powers' capture, and it is possible that the charges against him were dropped in exchange for this information. How accurate this is, though, we will never be able to tell because it happened so long ago and a lot of the records would be lost. But I don't know, because Ned didn't like people betraying him, so I'm having a hard time believing, just in my opinion for myself, that he actually betrayed Power. And Power did always believe that Kelly was responsible for the betrayal. So now we're going to look a little bit, because Power is so instrumental to Ned's story, and we're just going to look at a little bit of his criminal career. So the Benalla Ensign wrote, "The effect of his example has already been to draw one young fellow into the open vortex of crime. And unless his career is speedily cut short, young Kelly will blossom into a declared enemy of society. Horse theft, assault, and imprisonment." And unfortunately, the assumptions made by these reporters turned out that they weren't far from the truth. A hawker named Jeremiah McCormick accused a friend of the Kellys, Ben Gold, of stealing his horse. Gold wrote an incident note to give to McCormick's childless wife. It was used to wrap two calves' testicles. I don't know what that has to do with the story, but it was in the history, so they did some weird shit back then, I have to say. Kelly passed the note to one of his cousins to give to the lady. When McCormick confronted Kelly later that day, oh my God, I don't know why I keep finding this funny, but I just do. Kelly punched him in the nose, causing McCormack to fall. Kelly was arrested for his part in sending the calves' parts and the note for assaulting McCormack. Oh, okay, I get it now. It's so weird, like I'll read those things a couple of times before I do the video and like read it back to you guys. But, okay, so yuck. Yuck! Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't understand what that meant. They cut the calf's testicles off and wrapped the note around it. Okay, I get it. Well, that wasn't very nice. I just wanted to say, like, the calf was probably being cut, because that's what they do with them. Obviously, they didn't want him as a bull, but to send that to somebody's wife, that's pretty nasty. And I mean, the poor lady, she didn't have anything to do with with the things her husband was doing. So I think that's a bit rough, and I think they kind of went over the mark there. Okay, so I can understand that now. Wow. So Kelly was released from Beechworth Jail on the 27th of March 1871, and that was 5 weeks earlier than he would have been released, and he returned to Greta. 3 weeks later, horsebreaker Isaiah Wild Wright arrived in town to see his father Alex Gunn, a Scottish miner who had married Kelly's older sister. Wright was riding a chestnut mare which he had borrowed without telling the owner, the postmaster of Mansfield. I know they're doing the wrong things and everything, but they're such larrikins, I can't help but have a bit of a giggle at all the stuff they're doing. I'm sorry, I just find the Kellys and the family quite Amusing. Kelly later claimed that he was unaware that the horse didn't belong to Wright. The mare went missing that night, and Gunn lent Wright one of his own horses, promising that if he found the mare, he would keep it until Wright returned. Kelly said that as soon after Wright departed, the mare was found by Gunn and a neighbour, William Williamson. Kelly took the mare to Wangaratta, and he stayed there for 4 days. So the horses were swapped, they weren't actually stolen. So on April 20 of 1871, while riding back into Greta, Kelly was intercepted by Constable Edward Hall, who suspected that the horse was stolen, which it was not. Kelly was just bringing it back. He directed Kelly to the police station on the pretense of having to sign some papers. As Kelly dismounted, Hall tried to grab him by the scruff of the neck but failed. When Kelly resisted arrest, Hall drew his revolver and tried to shoot him, but it misfired 3 times. He was then overpowered by Kelly, who later said he straddled him and dug spurs into his thighs, causing the constable... Oh my goodness, I used to hear this a lot when I was a kid from like the old bushes around the place. Roar like a big calf attacked by dogs. After subduing Kelly with the assistance of 7 bystanders, Hall pistol whipped him until his head became a mass of raw and bleeding flesh. So as you can see, the Kellys were being quite harassed by the police. I mean, obviously they'd agreed they would swap horses until the horse could be found and brought back. Kelly was obviously bringing the horse back to Greta, to its owner. And this police constable didn't want to hear about it. He just wanted, I would say, just to fill his quota for the day, and he probably thought that he was going to make himself a hero because he'd captured one of the Kellys, and the most prominent of the Kellys, Ned. And this just goes to show, as I said before, how far back and far-reaching the police corruption in this country is. And it's such a disappointing thing to know that the people that you're supposed to rely on to protect you and to keep you safe are probably some of the worst criminals that we've ever had. And don't get me wrong, not all of our police are like that. Some of our police are absolutely amazing and heroic people. But the corruption does go back a very long way. And I'm even really surprised by this. But when I had heard, as you know, you grow up and you go to school, and I hope they are still teaching children about Ned in school. But yeah, you sort of got the idea that they were being harassed by the police. So Kelly and Gunn were then charged with stealing the horse. James Murdoch, a friend and neighbour of the Kellys, gave evidence that Ned had implied to him that the horse was stolen and had tried to recruit him to steal other horses. So I think a bit of fibbing had gone on there. Obviously, these were people who were trying to make themselves look big, and I don't think they actually realised what the far-reaching implications of their actions would actually be. And it was later revealed that Kelly was still in Beechworth jail when the horse was taken. The charges were downgraded to feloniously receiving a horse. Kelly and Gunn were sentenced to 3 years imprisonment with hard labour. Wright received 18 months for the illegal use of a horse. So he didn't get off scot-free either. But I think the whole thing was just a little bit unfair because nobody actually stole anybody's horse. And, nothing wrong was actually done. So I think they were all unjustly sent to prison. So Kelly served his sentence at Beechworth Jail and then at Pentridge Prison. I'm actually surprised that he didn't escape from Pentridge because everyone else did. On the 25th of June 1873, his good behaviour earned him a transfer to the prison ship Sacramento, anchored off Williamstown. He returned to Pentridge after several months and was released on the 2nd of February 1874. And that was 6 months early for good behaviour. When he returned to Greta, his brother Jim was in prison for horse theft, and his mother soon married an American named George King. So Kelly hadn't forgotten about Wright in all this time. So to settle the score with Wright over the chestnut mare, Kelly fought him in a bare-knuckle boxing match in the Imperial Hotel in Beechworth on the 8th of August 1874. Kelly won after 20 rounds and was declared the unofficial boxing champion of the district. Soon afterwards, a Melbourne photographer took a portrait of Kelly in a boxing pose. Right after this, as you would expect, became an ardent supporter of Ned Kelly. Because obviously Ned had shown him what was going to happen if he wasn't a supporter. After his release from prison, Kelly worked at a sawmill and later for a builder. In early 1877, he joined his stepfather in an organised horse stealing operation, along with Wright, another man named Brecky Williamson, another man named Joe Byrne, another man, Aaron Sherritt, and two other men, Alan Lowry and Albert Saxon. Kelly later claimed that the group stole 280 horses. A number of this group also belonged to the Greta mob, a gang of bush larrikins who adopted a distinctive flash form of dress. The Greta mob also included Ned's brother Jim and Dan and his cousins Tom and Jack Lloyd. So they were definitely keeping it in the family. On the 18th of September 1877, Kelly was arrested in Benalla for riding over a footpath while drunk. The following day, he was involved in a brawl with 4 police officers who were escorting him to court. And 2 of the officers involved were Constables Alex Fitzpatrick, who was actually a friend of Ned's, and Tom Lonigan. Oh my goodness. Who had grabbed Kelly by his manly parts during the fracas. Kelly was found guilty of being drunk and disorderly, resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer, but he was fined and then released. The claim that Kelly vowed that if he ever shot a man, it was going to be Lonigan. And this could be a little bit prophetic as to what happens later in Ned's story. However, Kelly later claimed that Fitzpatrick subsequently harassed his family because Kelly had knocked him down during the brawl. And, knowing what the police were like back then and also in the years that followed, I believe that. In August of 1877, Ned, with his stepfather George and a number of accomplices, had stolen 11 horses from a paddock owned by James Whitty, a wealthy local grazier. Kelly altered the brands on the horses and sold 6 of them to William Baumgarten, a horse dealer in Barnawatha, near the New South Wales-Victoria border. On the 26th of September, the horses were listed as stolen and the police began an investigation. On the 10th of November, Baumgarten and his brother Gustav were arrested for selling stolen horses, and the police were on Kelly's trail. A warrant for his arrest in relation to the Whitty larceny was sworn in March of 1878, and a further warrant for the arrest of his younger brother Dan was issued on the 5th of April. In this time, George King disappeared. He was never to be seen again, so whether he went into hiding or whether one of his associates may have done away with him, we'll never know. It's never been made clear what happened to him. He simply disappeared. So now we move on to what was known as the Fitzpatrick incident, and this is Constable Fitzpatrick's version of events. The Fitzpatrick incident would occur on the 11th of April 1878. Constable Strahan, the official officer in charge of the Greta police station, heard that Kelly was at a shearing shed in New South Wales and was given leave to apprehend him. Constable Fitzpatrick was ordered to Greta for relief duty. Fitzpatrick read in the Police Gazette of a warrant for Dan Kelly's arrest for horse stealing, and he discussed this with his sergeant at Benalla, the idea of calling at the Kelly home on the way to Greta to arrest Dan. The sergeant agreed but warned him to be very careful. On the 15th of April, Fitzpatrick rode through Winton en route to Greta, stopping at the hotel there where he had a brandy and a lemonade, and I think back then that was also known as a shandy, as also beer and lemonade was known as. So he got to the Kelly residence and he found that Dan was not at home. But Fitzpatrick did remain with Kelly's mother in conversation for about an hour. 3 children were also present, according to Fitzpatrick, upon hearing someone chopping wood. He went to ensure that the chopping was licensed. So the wood chopper proved to be Bricky Williamson, a neighbour who said he didn't need a licence because he was chopping wood on his own selection. So Fitzpatrick saw 2 horsemen making their way towards Ned Kelly's house. The men proved to be the teenager Dan Kelly and his brother-in-law Bill Skillion. And Bill Skillion was also known as Bill Skilling. I just saw something else. There's a lot of things going on in my house today. Oh, sorry, it just keeps attracting my attention. I don't know if you guys saw it or not. So Fitzpatrick returned to the house and made the arrest. Dan asked to be allowed to have dinner before leaving, and the constable would consent to allow him to have dinner, and he stood guard over Dan while he had his dinner. But in this time, Ned would rush through the front door and fired a shot at Fitzpatrick with a revolver, missing him. I can't help but giggle at this. What a spirited family. I mean, his mother, wow, what a lady. Ned Kelly's mother then hit Fitzpatrick over the head with a fire shovel. There was a struggle and Kelly fired 2 more shots, wounding Fitzpatrick just above his left wrist. During the struggle, Skillion and Williamson entered the room, both armed with revolvers. Dan disarmed Fitzpatrick and now had his revolver. Oh my goodness, imagine this. You just go to make a simple arrest and then chaos ensues. Ned told Fitzpatrick that he wouldn't have fired at him if he had known it was him. So, after this, I mean, the poor police officer had all this awful thing happen, but I can't help but see the funny side of it all. Just imagining the scene going on in Ned Kelly's home at this time, I can't just help but have a bit of a giggle about it. I'm sorry, I keep having a giggle, but it just all sounds so funny to me. But I am sorry that the officer was wounded. So after this, Fitzpatrick fainted, and when he regained consciousness, Kelly compelled him to extract the bullet from his own arm with a knife. Kelly's mother dressed the wound, and Kelly concocted a story to cover up what happened, and he said that if Fitzpatrick told his story, that he would reward him after the Baumgarten case was over. So, I mean, you know, Ned sort of come in, he shot his police officer friend, but he has tried to help make up for it. Even though I think maybe making him dig the bullet out of his arm himself was going a bit far, like, couldn't Ned have done that for him? I mean, he did shoot him, so, you know, it probably would have gone a little bit, that would have gone a long way if Ned had actually helped him himself, but I guess he had his reasons for making him do that. So, Kelly's mother said that if he mentioned what really happened, his life would be no good for him, so she was quite the lady. And I know it's kind of criminal behaviour, but you kind of have to admire that. She was really sticking up for her family there. You know, these frontiers women and these colonial women, they did have to do that. But wow, she was quite a lady, and I can't help but admire her just a little bit. So Fitzpatrick was then allowed to leave, and he had ridden away for about a mile when he found out that 2 horsemen were pursuing him. But by spurring his horse into a gallop, he escaped to the Winton Hotel, and he was then assisted inside by the manager. His wound was rebandaged, and he was given a brandy and water. The manager then rode with him to Benalla, where he reported the affair to his superior officer. So the Kelly family do have their own version of events of the Fitzpatrick incident. Family would write on their own version of events to the Fitzpatrick incident. And it will go as follows. The witness which can prove Fitzpatrick's falsehood can be found by advertising, and if this is not done immediately, horrible disasters shall follow. Fitzpatrick shall be the cause of greater slaughter to the rising generation than St. Patrick was to the snakes and toads in Ireland. For had I robbed, plundered, ravished, and murdered everything I met, my character could not be painted blacker than it is at present. But thank God my conscience is as clear as the snow in Peru. Kelly sent this in a letter to Superintendent John Sadleir and the parliamentarian Donald Cameron in December of 1878. In an interview 3 months before his execution, Kelly said that at the time of the incident he was actually 200 miles from home. According to him, his mother had asked Fitzpatrick if he had a warrant, and Fitzpatrick replied that he only had a telegram. To which his mother said that Dan need not go then. Fitzpatrick then said, pulling out a revolver, "I will blow your brains out if you interfere." His mother replied, "You would not be so handy with that pop gun of yours if my Ned was here." Dan then said, trying to trick Fitzpatrick, "There is Ned coming along by the side of the house now." While he was pretending to look out the window for Ned, Dan cornered Fitzpatrick, took the revolver and released Fitzpatrick unharmed. If Fitzpatrick suffered any wounds, they were possibly self-inflicted. Skillion and Williamson were in fact not present. So that's a very, very different version of events to what the constable said. And I think that's why I kind of found the scene so funny, because it sort of sounded, it did kind of sound like a made-up story, but then I could imagine Ned rushing through the door and punching this guy out to avenge his family. So that's very interesting at how different the two versions of events were, and that Kelly's family were as witnesses there for Ned, and Fitzpatrick didn't have a witness to substantiate his claims. So that's really interesting, and again, just shows how bad the police corruption was even back then. So in 1879, Ned's sister Kate, who was then aged 14 at the time of the incident, stated that Kelly shot Fitzpatrick after the constable had made a sexual advance towards her. After Kelly was captured, he denied that Fitzpatrick tried to take liberties with Kate. "No, that is a foolish story. If he or any other policeman tried to take liberties with my sister, Victoria would not hold him." So in 1929, journalist J.J. Keneally gave yet another version of the incident based on interviews with the remaining Kelly brother Jim and Kelly cousin and gang providor Tom Lloyd. In this version, Fitzpatrick was drunk when he arrived at the Kelly house, and while sitting in front of the fire, he pulled Kate onto his knee, provoking Dan to throw him to the floor. In the ensuing struggle, Fitzpatrick drew his revolver, Ned appeared, and with his brother seized the constable, disarming him, but not before he struck his wrist against the projecting part of the door lock, an injury he would later claim to be a gunshot wound. So there's a lot of different versions of events, and they're all very different to each other. So it's a little bit hard to tell who was telling the truth, but I think I would go with the Kelly's family's first version of events. 3 police officers later gave sworn evidence that Kelly, after his capture, admitted he had shot Fitzpatrick. Bricky Williamson, who was seeking remission for his sentence in relation to the incident, stated that Kelly shot Fitzpatrick after the constable had drawn his revolver. Jones and Dawson have argued that Kelly shot Fitzpatrick, but it was his friend Joe Byrne who was with him, not Bill Skillion. So I can see how this got very muddied over time. There were just so many different versions of events. But I think I'm going to go with what I believe was the first story that the Kellys gave. I think that would be closer to the truth, because the rest of it just sounds a bit convoluted. So at the trial, Williamson, Skillion and Ellen Kelly were arrested and charged with aiding and abetting an attempted murder. Ned and Dan were nowhere to be found. The 3 appeared on the 9th of October 1878 before Judge Redmond Barry. Fitzpatrick, doctor who had treated his wound, gave evidence that the constable was certainly not drunk and that his wounds were consistent with his statement. The defence declined to call Ned's sisters Kate and 12-year-old Grace to give evidence, even though they were eyewitnesses. The defence did call 2 witnesses to give evidence that Skillion wasn't present, which would cast doubt on Fitzpatrick's entire evidence. One of these witnesses was a friend of the Kellys, the other Joe Ryan, a relative. Ryan revealed that Ned was in Greta that afternoon, which was damaging to the defence. Ellen, Kelly, Skillion and Williamson were convicted as accessories to the attempted murder of Fitzpatrick. Skillion and Williamson both received sentences of 6 years and Ellen 3 years of hard labour. And you have to think back then, this was a pretty harsh sentence for a woman, and Ellen's sentence was considered harsh, even by people who had no cause to be sympathetic to the Kelly family, especially as she was nursing a newborn baby at the time. Alfred Wyatt, a police magistrate in Benalla, told later a Royal Commission, "I thought that the sentence upon that old woman, Mrs. Kelly, was a very severe one indeed." I'm not sure how old Ned's mother was at this time to be called an old woman, but if she was still having children, she couldn't have been that old. So she was probably maybe in her late 30s, probably in her early 40s by then. And women back then, they were having children until menopause, some of them. So, yeah, you have to think that would have been a very hard sentence for her, because she was obviously having a hard life as it was. She'd had all these children, she had a new baby, and then she gets sentenced to hard labour in jail. I can imagine it would have been very hard on Ned's mother indeed. So now we get to what was known as the Stringy Bark Siege, or the Stringy Bark Massacre, and the police murders that would see Ned tried, convicted and executed for the crime. So following the Fitzpatrick incident, Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly and Joe Byrne went into hiding and were soon joined by Steve Hart, a friend of Dan's. They were based at Bullock Creek in the Wombat Ranges, where they made money sluicing gold and distilling whiskey. And for you guys in the United States, yes, we're talking moonshine, and were supplied with provisions and information by sympathisers, including Ned's cousin, Tom Lloyd. Police had received information that the Kelly gang were in the Wombat Ranges at the head of the King River, and on the 25th of October 1878, 2 mounted police parties were dispatched to search for the gang. One party, consisting of Sergeant Michael Kennedy and Constables Michael Scanlon, Thomas Lonigan and Thomas McIntyre, camped overnight in an abandoned mining site at Stringy Bark Creek, about 25 miles north of Mansfield. They were unaware that they were only 1.5 miles from the Kelly gang's hideout, and that Ned had already observed their tracks. So the police were there looking for the Kelly gang. Unbeknownst to them, the Kelly gang had found them. Ned knew that they were close. On the following morning, Kennedy and Scanlon went scouting, while McIntyre and Lonigan remained at the camp. And remember who Lonigan was. At about 5 p.m, the 4 members of the Kelly gang emerged from the bush and ordered the 2 policemen in the camp to bail up and raise their arms. According to McIntyre, each member of the gang was armed with a rifle, but according to Ned, they only had 2 guns. McIntyre was unarmed at the time and raised his arms. According to McIntyre, Lonigan made a motion to draw his revolver and ran for the cover of a tree a few yards away. Ned immediately shot Lonigan, killing him instantly. According to Ned, however, Lonigan had ducked behind a fallen tree, and Ned shot him as he raised his head to fire back at him. The Kelly gang would then question McIntyre and arm themselves with a policeman's shotgun and his revolver. At about 5:30 p.m, Kennedy and Scanlon returned on horseback, and the Kelly gang hid themselves. According to McIntyre, he walked towards Kennedy, but before he could speak to him, obviously to warn him that Ned and the gang were close, the Kelly gang ordered the police once again to bail up. Kennedy tried to unclip his gun holster and shots were fired by the gang. McIntyre advised Kennedy to surrender as he was surrounded. Meanwhile, Scanlon dismounted and was shot while trying to unsling his rifle. McIntyre stated that Scanlon didn't have time to fire a shot, but according to Ned, Scanlon fired and Ned shot him as he tried to fire again, and Scanlon would die soon after this of his wounds. Kennedy had dismounted and, according to McIntyre, tried to surrender without firing a shot, but the gang continued firing at him. According to Ned, Kennedy hid behind a tree and started firing. Kennedy then retreated into the bush, with Ned and Dan pursuing him for almost a mile and exchanging gunfire with the sergeant, before Ned shot him in his right side. According to Ned, Kennedy then turned around to face him and Ned shot him in the chest with his shotgun, not realizing that Kennedy had dropped his revolver and was turning to surrender. So that's unfortunate, and I do actually feel for the police in this situation, and also for the Kelly gang. I think it was just bad on both sides. In the exchange of gunfire, McIntyre, who was still unarmed, mounted Kennedy's horse and was able to escape. He reached Mansfield Police Station the following day, and the search party quickly found the bodies of Lonergan and Scanlon. Kennedy's body was found 2 days later. The bodies had been looted of watches, rings, and other personal items. Post-mortem examinations showed that Lonergan had been shot 3 times through the arm, the leg, and the right eye, the latter being the cause of his death. Scanlon had 4 bullet wounds. Kennedy had at least 2 bullet wounds, one a shotgun wound through the chest fired from a very close range. McIntyre's initial accounts of the shootout were given at Mansfield on the 27th of October and at the inquest into the deaths of Lonergan and Scanlon on the 29th of October. Kelly's initial accounts of the killings were given in his Cameron letter of December 1878 and the Jerilderie letter of February 1879. These and later accounts by McIntyre and Kelly varied in their details greatly again, so we're nearly going back to the Fitzpatrick incident here. Jones Morrissey and others have questioned the credibility of some aspects of both versions of events. In the Jerilderie letter, Kelly claimed that he had been told that a number of police officers had boasted that they would shoot him without giving him a chance to surrender. And that could have been true. They probably just wanted to capture Ned and maybe kill him as an example, who knows. He also claimed that the weapons, especially the 2 rifles and the amount of ammunition the police party carried, indicated their intention of killing rather than arresting him. He also claimed that under these circumstances and the failure of the police to surrender when ordered to, justified him killing them in self-defense. So it's kind of his word against a policeman, McIntyre, who was the only witness on the police side. McIntyre stated that he told Kelly that the intention of the police party was in fact to arrest him and that they were not excessively armed in the circumstances. He stated that it was the Kelly gang who confronted the police with their weapons drawn and that they did not give the police a realistic chance to surrender. And that may have been true if Ned was believing at that time that they were not, the Kelly gang were not going to be given the chance to surrender. So maybe he was thinking, we're going to get him first. Following this, a proclamation by Governor George Bowen declaring Ned and Dan Kelly outlaws, news of the police murders led to widespread fear of the bushrangers. On the 28th of October, the Government of Victoria announced a reward of £800, £200 per head for their arrest. And this was soon increased to £2,000. And back then, that was a heck of a lot of money, so they really wanted these guys caught. On the 31st of October 1878, the Victorian Parliament passed the Felons Apprehension Act, which came into effect on the 1st of November. 3 days later, notices were published throughout the colony, giving the bushrangers until the 12th of November to surrender themselves. On the 15th of November, the 4 members of the Kelly gang not having surrendered themselves were declared as outlaws. As a result, members of the gang could be killed without challenge by anyone finding them. and especially if they found them armed or had a reasonable suspicion that they were armed. The Act also penalised anyone who gave any aid or shelter or sustenance to the outlaws. So that meant if you gave Ned Kelly a drink of water or something to eat, or just let him pass by without acknowledging him, you were considered an accessory. If you withheld information or gave false information to the authorities regarding Ned and his gang as well, you were going to be punished. And that punishment was imprisonment with or without hard labour for such a period not extending 15 years. And that was just if you were seen to be an accessory after the fact, or if you had aided them in some way. So they were really out to get Ned and his boys. The Felons Apprehension Act eventually lapsed on the 26th of June in 1880, just before the siege at Glenrowan. The Victorian Act was based on the Felons Apprehension Act of 1865, which was passed by the Parliament of New South Wales. The Act had been enacted in response to the bushrangers Dan Morgan and Ben Hall. And you would have seen a picture of Ben on his horse in the opening credits for the Bushrangers series. And I will be covering Ben and Dan in a further video. And I'm really quite excited about this series. I think it's going to be interesting and a lot of fun. Because as you can see, like, the Bushrangers weren't all serious, you know, shooting people and stealing things all the time. They were like probably the first traditional Aussie larrikins, and there was a bit of a sense of humour around them. So it's going to be an interesting series with all of our bushrangers that we had. In response to the Kelly Gang, the New South Wales Parliament reenacted their legislation as the Felons Apprehension Act 1879. So now we're coming up to the raid at Euroa. After the police killings, the Kelly Gang unsuccessfully attempted to escape across the flooded Murray River into New South Wales before returning to their base in northeastern Victoria. They had narrowly avoided the police on several occasions and were relying on the support of the extended Kelly family, criminal associates and other sympathisers. In need of money, the Kelly Gang planned to rob the bank in the small town of Euroa. On Sunday, the 8th of December 1878, Byrne scouted the town and reported back that there would be a funeral and a sitting of the licensing court on the following Tuesday afternoon, that many in town would be attending. So they were looking for the opportunity to rob this bank when people wouldn't be around to see them do it, and maybe they could get away with it. So at 12:30 p.m. on the 9th of December, the gang held up the Young Husband Pastoral Substation at Faithfuls Creek, and that was about 3.5 miles from Euroa. 14 male employees and passers-by were taken hostage and held overnight in a brick-out building near the Faithfuls Creek homestead. Female hostages were held in the homestead. One of the hostages was a passing hawker who supplied the 4 members of the gang with new respectable clothes. It is probable that the hawker and a number of other hostages were sympathisers of the gang and had prior knowledge to the raid. So this was probably why everybody was so agreeable. They were actually friends of Ned Kelly. The following day, Dan guarded the hostages while Ned, Byrne and Hart rode out to cut the telegraph wires connecting Euroa to the outside world. After he did so, the gang encountered a hunting party and some railway workers, whom they held up and took back to Faithfuls Creek as hostages as well. So it's becoming a little bit of a party there at Faithfuls Creek. Dan, Ned and Hart then went into Euroa, leaving Byrne to guard the prisoners. And that's getting to be a fair few prisoners. I think Byrne had his job cut out for him there. Just after 4 p.m, the 3 gang members knocked at the doors of the closed National Bank of Australasia at Euroa and gained entry from the front and back. They drew their revolvers and held up both the bank and the bank manager's living quarters. They emptied the safes and cashier drawers of cash and gold worth £2,260 and a small number of documents and securities. So that would probably include deed titles to land, that kind of thing. The 14 members of the bank manager's household and staff were also, oh my God, it just sounds so funny. I know they sort of had to get everyone together, but it's nearly like becoming a party out at Faithfuls Creek Homestead. As you guessed it, the bank manager and his household staff and the staff from the bank were taken to Faithfuls Creek Homestead, also as hostages. So yeah, it's getting just to be a party over there. It makes me wonder, what the mood was like and how they were actually treating them. I think that would have been really interesting to be a fly on the wall. There, the gang performed some trick riding for the hostages. Well, that's nice of them. They're keeping them entertained. Who now numbered, oh my goodness, 37 people before leaving at about 8:30 p.m, warning their captives to remain where they were for 3 hours. Oh yes, there would be reprisals. I can't help having a bit of a giggle at this. They've taken all these people hostages and then they did some trick riding for them to keep them entertained and then they let them go. So that was pretty nice. None of the hostages were harmed, so that's good. Following the raid, a number of newspapers commented on the efficiency of his execution and compared it with oh, this is funny. This is making me laugh. They compared it with the inefficiency of the police who had failed to capture the gang in the 6 weeks since the Stringy Bark police killings. Several hostages stated that the gang had behaved courteously and without violence during the raid. However, hostages also stated that on several occasions Kelly and other gang members had become enraged and had cocked their revolvers and pointed them at the hostages, and they did threaten to shoot them. The gang had also threatened to burn buildings containing hostages if there was any resistance. And I honestly don't think Ned was that bad of a guy to just ordinary people living in Australia at that time. I think those would have been idle threats just to keep the hostages behaving in the manner that they wanted them to. So this leads us to the Cameron letter. While at Faithfuls Creek Homestead, Byrne wrote out 2 fair copies of a letter that had been dictated by Ned himself, allegedly. On the 14th of December 1878, the copies were posted to Donald Cameron, the Cameron letter, a Victorian parliamentarian who Kelly wrongly thought was sympathetic to the gang. Oh boy. And John Sadleir, the police superintendent at Benalla. In the letter, Kelly made claims of police corruption and harassment. Are we surprised by this? Considering other cases we've covered here. So the claims of police corruption and harassment of his family, and gave his version of the Fitzpatrick incident, the Stringy Bark police killings and other events. Kelly expected Cameron to read the letter out in Parliament, but the government refused to make it public. Newspapers, however, published summaries of its contents with commentary. Kelly later repeated much of the contents of the letter in the longer Jerilderie letter. We move on to what actually happened to Kelly's sympathisers. Because don't forget, if you were found to be a sympathiser, you're going to be in trouble too. So the imprisonment of 23 Kelly sympathisers without trial swung public sympathy away from the police. On the 2nd of January 1879, police used the Felons Apprehension Act to obtain warrants for the arrest of presumed Kelly sympathisers for aiding the outlaws. 30 men, oh my goodness, 30 people. And this is just on suspicion. 30 men were arrested in the following days and 23 were remanded in custody. Among the leading Kelly sympathisers who were held were Tom Lloyd Jr., Jimmy Quinn, Wild Wright and Joe Ryan. Over a third were released within several weeks due to lack of evidence. But a core of 9 sympathisers had their remand renewed on a weekly basis for almost 3 months, despite the failure of the police to produce evidence for a committal hearing. Police claimed that their informants were reluctant to give sworn evidence for fear of reprisals. And, that's understandable. On the 22nd of April, Police Magistrate Foster refused prosecution request to continue remands and discharge the remaining 11 detainees. Although the police command was disturbed by this decision, by then it was clear that the tactic of holding sympathisers on continuous remand had not impeded the activities of the Kelly gang. And I mean, if Ned and his boys were in hiding and, they were trying not to sort of be seen, they probably didn't even know most of these people were remanded in custody, and some of them may have been people that weren't sympathisers at all and that Ned and his boys probably didn't even know. So Jones argued that the decision to hold key Kelly sympathisers without trial for several months swung the public's sympathy away from the police, as we explored before, and of course it would. These people were held without proof and without charge. Dawson, however, points out that while there was widespread condemnation of the denial of the civil liberties of those detained, this didn't necessarily mean that there was widespread support for the outlaws. But I think it's self-evident that there was quite a bit of widespread support for Ned and his boys. Probably by people who did know them and knew their character, but there would have been a lot of people who were sympathetic towards Ned. So we get to the Jerilderie raid. The gang holds up at the Jerilderie police station following the Euroa raid. 58 police were transferred to northeastern Victoria, making a total of 217 police in the district, and around 50 soldiers were deployed to guard banks in the region. And the reward for Kelly's capture was increased to a whopping £1,000. And you have to remember, that was a lot of money back then. The Kelly gang had distributed most of the proceeds from the raid to family, friends and associates who had given them assistance, thereby earning them the Robin Hood-like legend in the district. Outlaws were once more in need of funds and planned to rob the bank at Jerilderie, a town of 500 residents about 40 miles across the border in New South Wales. A number of sympathisers moved into town in the days before the raid to provide information and undercover support for the gang. On Friday, the 7th of February 1879, the Kelly gang crossed the Murray River between Mulwala and Tocumwal and camped overnight in the thick forest. The following day, they visited Davidson's Inn about 2 miles from Jerilderie, where they drank and chatted with patrons and staff, learning more about the town and the police presence there. So you have to wonder, did these people, were they seen as sympathisers to Ned Kelly after what happened in Jerilderie? Who knows? Just after midnight on the morning of Sunday the 9th of February, the gang went to the Jerilderie police barracks about half a mile from the town centre on the pretext of alerting the police to a fictitious brawl at Davidson's Inn. After confirming that there were only 2 policemen present, Senior Constable George Devine and Probationary Constable Henry Richards, the gang drew their revolvers and bailed the policemen up. They secured the policemen in the lockup near the main building and spent the night in the residential quarters of the police station, where they held Devine's wife and young children hostage. But if the way they treated the people at the homestead, I don't think that the children or the lady were harmed in any way. So the Kelly gang spent most of the Sunday morning preparing for the bank robbery, while many of the town's population were attending church. In the afternoon, Byrne and Hart, dressed in police uniforms, took the disarmed Constable Richards with them into town so they could familiarise themselves with its layout. Richards was told to introduce the strangers as police reinforcements sent to search for the Kelly gang. So that's pretty clever on the part of Ned and his gang to disguise themselves as police officers. Nobody would have seen that coming. The 3 then returned to the police barracks and the gang finalised their plans for the following day's raid. At 10 a.m. on the 10th of February, Kelly and Byrne donned police uniforms and the 4 outlaws took Richards with them into town. They had left Devine in the police lockup and warned Mrs. Devine that if she tried to leave the barracks, they would burn them down with her and her children inside. But knowing Ned's character, I would say that was another idle threat just to keep her compliant. The gang went into the main street of Jerilderie and held up the Royal Mail Hotel, which was next door to the Bank of New South Wales. They took the hotel staff and patrons hostage. As the raid progressed, anyone walking into the hotel was captured and held in the hotel's parlour. And again, it is thought that it is almost certain that some of those held were sympathisers to Ned and the gang. Ned and Byrne then entered the bank from the rear, leaving Dan and Hart in control of the hotel. Ned and Byrne held up the bank, taking £2,141 in cash, as well as jewellery and other valuables. Ned also took deeds, mortgages and securities from the safe, which he later burnt. The bank staff and several patrons were taken prisoner and transferred also to the parlour of the hotel. So here you go, they're keeping everyone together in the parlour of the hotel, just like they did back at the homestead. Byrne then held up the post office and destroyed the Morse key and the insulator. Again, very smart. So for those youngsters, like very young youngsters of you who are watching this video, so the Morse key, how do I describe this? Back before we had telephones and things like that, everything was sent by telegraph. And before that, the other ways of communication were sent by Morse code. And it was like a series of like sounds and clicks that they'd make on the insulator machine. So what I can sort of give you as an example for that is like the SOS signal. It's one that's well known. And it was like 3 dots, like ... and then followed by 3 dashes, which would be ... ... ... ... ... So that was like how people would know somebody was signalling for help. And what SOS meant was save our souls. So there would have been like any number of ways that they would send messages back and forth using Morse code, any number of clicks and dots that would make up words, letters, what have you, to send the messages back and forth. So if you want to look up Morse code and also look up how they used it on the Titanic, it's very interesting. Following this, several of the prisoners were ordered to take axes and bring down the telephone poles and wires. Once the telegraph was cut, Ned went with 2 hostages to the newspaper owner's home, where he asked for copies of his Jerilderie letter to be printed. The newspaper owner, however, had earlier escaped capture at the bank and he had fled town. So I guess Ned didn't get his letter printed at that particular time. So after a detour to appraise a locally famous racehorse, oh wow, he's busy. He's a busy boy, our Ned. Ned returned to the hotel and delivered a speech to his hostages, outlining his grievances against the police and the justice system. He then told the hostages, who by now numbered about 30, that they were free to go. However, he took Richards and the 2 post office workers who knew how to operate the telegraph with him to the police barracks. Back at the barracks, the gang secured the 2 policemen and 2 post office workers in the lockup and prepared to leave with the proceeds from the bank robbery. And they would also leave with the police horses and their weapons. Mrs. Devine was threatened with reprisals if she released the prisoners before 7:30 p.m. I don't know. I just don't know why I keep finding this funny, but I do. Like, they've tried to like paint Ned as this ruthless, murdering outlaw, but it seems to me, apart from the police that he felt that were harassing him and his family, he didn't really kill that many people, and he was actually pretty nice to the hostages. I mean, it's not nice to threaten, okay, we're going to come back and shoot you if you let these people go early, or we're going to burn down your house if you don't do as we say. But I honestly think a lot of what Ned said to them to get them to remain compliant was idle threats, because he knew what it was like to be threatened like that. But yeah, I can't help finding just the way they went about things just a little bit humorous. Ned and Hart rode back into town, where Ned stayed a short while drinking at the Albion, or the Travellers' Rest Hotel, with the strangers who had recently entered the town and were soon to leave. While there, the local parson, John B. Gribble, persuaded Ned to leave the racehorse he had taken, as it belonged to a young lady. When Kelly and Hart left, they were not seen again by the police for 17 months. So they hid themselves pretty well for quite some time. So now we move on to Ned's Jerilderie letter. And it would start, "I wish to acquaint you with some of the occurrences of the past, the present, and the future." So some of the 56 pages comprising Ned's Jerilderie letter are on display in the State Library of Victoria if you would like to see them. So prior to arriving in Jerilderie, Kelly composed a lengthy letter with the aim of tracing his path to becoming an outlaw, justifying his actions and outlining the alleged injustices he and his family suffered at the hands of the police. He also decried the treatment of poor selector families by Victoria's squatterocracy, and in an escalating promise of revenge and retribution, invoked a mythical tradition of Irish rebellion against what he called the tyrannism of the English yoke. So he dictated the letter to burn. The Jerilderie letter, a handwritten document of 56 pages and 7,391 words, was described by Kelly as a bit of my life. He tasked Edwin Living, a local bank accountant, with delivering it to the editor of the Jerilderie and the Urania Gazette for publication. Due to political suppression, only excerpts were published in the press. Based on a copy transcribed by John Hanlon, owner of the 8 Mile Hotel in Deniliquin, the entire letter was rediscovered and published in 1930. According to historian Alex McDermott, Kelly inserts himself into history on his own terms with his own voice. We hear the living speaker in a way that no other document in our history achieves. It has been interpreted as a proto-republican manifesto, but for others it is a murderous and maniacal rant, and a remarkable insight into Kelly's own grandiosity. Noted for its unorthodox grammar, the letter reaches delirious poetics, Kelly's language being hyperbolic, elusive, hallucinatory, full of striking metaphors and images. His invective and sense of humour are also present. In one well-known passage, he calls the Victorian police, and I quote our darling Ned, a parcel of big, ugly, fat-necked, wombat-headed, big-bellied, magpie-legged, narrow-hipped, splaw-footed sons of Irish bailiffs and English landlords. The letter closes. So that's a very... yeah, you can see Ned's sense of humour. It's a very, very colourful description of the police. He would also go on to say, neglect this and abide by the consequences, which shall be worse than the rust in the wheat of Victoria or the drought of a dry season to the grasshoppers in New South Wales. I do not wish to give the order full force without giving a timely warning. But I am a widow's son, outlawed, and my orders must be obeyed. So that was just some of Ned's letter. I haven't been able to obtain a full copy of the letter, so I'll just read the excerpts as they come up. But I'm sure if you look online for historical sites, there should be a copy of Ned's letter that you can read from start to finish if you want to read all 56 pages of it. Following this, there was an $8,000 reward notice for the capture of the Kelly gang, equivalent to $1.5 million in modern Australian currency. In response to the Jerilderie raid, the New South Wales government and several banks collectively issued £4,000 for the gang's capture, dead or alive. The largest reward offered in the colony since £5,000 was placed on the heads of the outlawed Clark brothers in 1867. The Victorian government matched the offer for the Kelly gang, bringing the total amount to $8,000, bushranging's largest ever reward. So you can imagine people were pretty keen to catch Ned and his gang to get their hands on that reward money. The Victorian Police continued to receive many reports of sightings of the outlaws from the public and information about their activities from their network of paid informants. The Chief Commissioner of Police, Frederick Standish, and Superintendent Francis Hare directed operations against the gang from Benalla. Hare organised frequent search parties and surveillance of the close family and associates of the Kelly gang. In March 1879, 6 Queensland Native Police troopers and a senior constable under the command of Sub-Inspector Stanhope O'Connor were deployed to Benalla to join the hunt for the Kelly gang. O'Connor and his troopers at the time of the request were in active service in the Cooktown region, conducting punitive expeditions against Aboriginal communities. Oh my God, this is awful. This is awful. I hate to bring this up, but it's part of the history, so forgive me for this. And had recently massacred 30 people near Cape Bedford. Although Kelly feared the tracking ability of their Aboriginal troopers, Standish and Hare doubted their value and they were not put to their best use. The Aboriginal troopers were withdrawn on the 25th of June 1880, but quickly re-engaged following the murder of police informant Aaron Sherritt the following day. On May 1879, Standish provided the Victorian Land Board with a list of 84 family members and other alleged sympathisers to the outlaws in order to prevent them buying land in the secluded areas of northeastern Victoria. The avowed claim of the policy was to disperse the Kelly family and its sympathisers and disrupt stock theft in the region. The impact of the policy is controversial. Jones and others claimed that it caused widespread resentment and hardened support for the outlaws. Morrissey, however, states that although the policy was sometimes used unfairly, it was effective and supported by the majority of the community. On the 3rd of July 1879, following media and parliamentary criticism of the cost and lack of success of the Kelly gang search, Standish appointed Assistant Commissioner Charles Nicholson in charge of the operations at Benalla in place of the injured Hare. Standish removed 14 troopers and 17 foot police from Nicholson's command, withdrew most of the soldiers guarding banks, and cut the budget for the search. Nicholson responded by cutting back search parties and relying more heavily on targeted surveillance and his network of spies and informers. Ooh, now we're getting into the sneaky side of things. Spies. On the 2nd of June 1880, after almost a year of unsuccessful efforts to capture the outlaws, Nicholson was replaced by Hare. On the 20th of May, a police informant, Daniel Kennedy, had reported that the Kelly gang had successfully made bulletproof armour out of agricultural equipment and were planning yet another raid. On the 25th of June, Kennedy personally reported this information to Hare. Hare dismissed the intelligence as preposterous and sacked Kennedy. So now we are moving up to the Glenrowan affair. The murder of Aaron Sherritt. I looked upon Kelly as an extraordinary man. There is no man in the world like him. He is superhuman. And that was what Aaron Sherritt said to Superintendent Hare. During the Kelly outbreak, police watch parties monitored houses belonging to relatives of the gang, including that of Byrne's mother, in the Woolshed Valley near Beechworth. The police used the house of her neighbour, Aaron Sherritt, former Greta Mob member and lifelong friend of Byrne, as a base of operations, and they were sleeping inside during the day and keeping watch from nearby caves at night. Sherritt accepted police payments for camping with the watch parties and for providing information on the bushrangers' activities. It is likely that Sherritt also gave the police false information in order to protect Byrne. Detective Michael Ward was particularly sceptical of Sherritt's value as an informer. In March 1879, Byrne's mother discovered Sherritt with a police surveillance party and later publicly denounced him as a spy. In the following months, Byrne and Ned sent Sherritt messages stating that the Lloyds and the Quinns wanted him shot, and that it would be better for him if he joined the outlaws. When Sherritt continued his relationship with the police, Byrne warned Sherritt's mother that the outlaws were going to kill him. The gang finally decided to murder Sherritt as part of their own plan, one that they boasted would astonish not only the Australian colonies but the entire world. On the 26th of June 1880, Dan and Byrne rode into the Woolshed Valley. That evening they kidnapped Anton Wick, who lived near Sherritt, and forced him to come with them to Sherritt's hut, which was occupied by Sherritt, his pregnant wife Ellen, Mrs. Barry, Ellen's mother, and 4 policemen who had been stationed in the hut to guard Sherritt and spy on Mrs. Byrne's home. At about 6:30 p.m, Dan went to the front door of the hut while Byrne forced Wick to knock on the back door and call out for Sherritt. When Sherritt answered the door, Byrne shot him in the throat and chest with a shotgun, killing him instantly. Byrne then entered the hut and Dan was let in while the 4 policemen hid in the bedroom. Byrne heard the police scrambling for their shotguns and demanded that they come out. When the police didn't respond, he fired into the bedroom. He then sent Ellen into the bedroom to bring the police out, but they then held her in the room. The outlaws left the hut with Mrs. Barry, collected kindling, and loudly threatened to burn alive those inside. They sent Mrs. Barry back inside and the police detained her in the bedroom. After a failed attempt to set fire to the building, the outlaws stayed outside yelling threats at the occupants. They then released Wick and rode away. The siege had lasted 2 hours. The police didn't leave the hut until the following morning for fear that the bushrangers would still be waiting outside for them. News of Sherritt's death only reached Hare in Benalla at 2:30 p.m. on Sunday the 27th of June. And that moves us up to the siege and the shootout. So the gang estimated that the policemen inside Sherritt's hut would relay news of his murder to Beechworth by early Sunday morning. And that they also thought that would prompt a special police train to be sent up from Melbourne. They also surmised that the train would collect reinforcements in Benalla before continuing through to Glenrowan, a small town in the Warby Ranges. There, the gang planned to derail the train and shoot dead any survivors. Then they planned to ride to the unpoliced Benalla, where they would rob the banks, set fire to the courthouses and blow up the police barracks. They had also planned to release anyone imprisoned in the jail and generally play havoc with the entire town before disappearing back into the bush. Oh, wow, this is so much, but I did warn you, this is a long story about our Ned. While Byrne and Dan were in the Woolshed Valley, Ned and Hart tried but failed to damage the track at Glenrowan, so they forced 2 local plate layers and some labourers camped nearby to finish the job. The outlaws selected a sharp curve in the line that ran across a deep ravine and told their captives that they were going to send the train and its occupants straight to hell. Byrne and Dan had now arrived at Glenrowan and the gang had taken over the railway station, the station master's home and Anne Jones's Glenrowan Inn, opposite the railway station and just under a mile from the town centre. The gang used the hotel to hold the workers and passers-by and other male prisoners they had gathered throughout the night and the following day. Most of the women and children taken prisoner were held at the station master's home. The other hotel in town, McDonald's Railway Hotel, located on the other side of the tracks, was used to stable the gang's stolen horses, one of which was carrying a tin of blasting powder and fuses. The pack horse also carried suits of bullet-repelling armour, each complete with a helmet and weighing about 44 kilos, which is around 97 pounds or so. The armour was designed to provide protection for the outlaws as they stood on the top of the embankment, firing down at any survivors of the train wreck. There was no leg armour as that would hinder the outlaws' movement and it wasn't necessary given the angle of any return fire up the embankment. By Sunday afternoon, the expected train had still not arrived and the outlaws had moved most of the women and children to the Glenrowan Inn. There were now 62 hostages, including sympathisers the gang had planted to help control the situation. As the hours passed without any sight of the train, the gang plied the hostages with drink and organised music, singing, dancing and games. So there you go again. They keep, for outlaws and criminals, as they were seen, they were actually treating their hostages really well. And one of the hostages would later testify that Ned did not treat us badly at all. Like, they were feeding them, they were giving them some drink, they were providing entertainment again, which I think that must be part of Ned's sense of humour coming out, that they were doing all that. Because, I have to have a giggle at that every time I hear it. It's like, okay, we've got all these people here, might as well have a party. Which is kind of a bit of an Australian thing anyway. Just everyone's here, let's have a party, let's open a beer, whatever. So I find that kind of funny, the way Ned was with the hostages, but at least he did treat them well. However, Ned did threaten to shoot another young hostage, keeping him in a state of extreme terror for about half an hour. Whether that's true or not, we'll never know, considering he was treating people well. It might not even be true. So during the late afternoon and the evening of Sunday, Ned allowed 21 of the hostages, who he considered to be trustworthy, to leave. At about 10 p.m, he and Byrne captured Glenrowan's lone constable, Hugh Bracken, with the assistance of hostage Tom Curnow, a local schoolmaster who sought to gain the gang's trust in order to thwart their plans. Believing that Curnow was a sympathiser, Ned let him and his wife return to their home close to the railway tracks, but warned them to go quietly to bed and not to dream out loud. So as you can see, Ned's language was quite different and just a little bit colourful. So, and quite poetic, as they said of his letter. The police train Ned had been expecting only left Benalla after 2 a.m. on Monday. The train carried 7 regular troopers under Superintendent Hare, 5 Queensland Aboriginal troopers under Sub-Inspector O'Connor, 4 journalists and several other civilians. Acting on intelligence that the tracks had been sabotaged, Hare had ordered a pilot engine to travel ahead of the police train. And that was pretty smart on the part of policeman Hare. At 2:30 a.m, the pilot train was approaching Glenrowan when Curnow went to the tracks, signalled it to stop, and alerted the driver of the danger. Kelly had by this time decided to let the hostages return home and was delivering them a lecture about police informers when Byrne came in from outside with the news that a train had arrived. The outlaws donned their armour and prepared themselves for the confrontation. Meanwhile, Bracken told the hostages to lie low and escaped to the railway station to explain the situation to the police. On hearing Bracken's news, Hare immediately led a detachment of police towards the hotel while the main body of the troopers prepared the horses and equipment. And at this point it was only it was just after 3 a.m. in the morning. The 4 outlaws positioned themselves in the shadow of the veranda in the front of the hotel and opened fire when the police were about 30 yards away in the moonlight. The police returned fire and about 100 to 150 shots were fired in 15 minutes. Someone shouted that there were women and children in the building and there was a lull in the shooting. Hare was wounded in the left wrist and soon had to return to Benalla for treatment. Ned was wounded in the left hand and arm and in his right foot. Byrne was shot in the leg and retreated into the hotel. 2 hostages were fatally wounded by police fire through the thin weatherboard walls of the building. 13-year-old John Jones and railway worker Martin Cherry, a 3rd hostage, George Metcalf, was also fatally wounded either by police fire or shot accidentally by Ned in an earlier incident. During the lull in the firing, a number of hostages, mostly women and children, would escape from the hotel. Kelly, bleeding heavily from his wounds, retreated behind the hotel and made his way into the bush where police found his skull cap and rifle at around 3:30 a.m. And this was about 100 yards from the hotel. Ned stated later that at that time he was in the bushes and he wasn't that far from the police. Police then surrounded the hotel throughout the night and the firing continued intermittently. At about 5 a.m, Byrne was fatally shot in the groin while making a toast to the Kelly gang in the bar. Between 5:30 a.m. and 7 a.m., police reinforcements under Sergeant Steele and Superintendent Sadleir arrived from Wangaratta and Benalla, taking the police contingent to about 40. And now we move on to Ned Kelly's last stand and subsequent capture. And it would go on to be described as this: a strange apparition. When Kelly appeared out of the mist-shrouded bush, clad in armour, bewildered policemen took him to be a ghost or a bunyip. Old Nick himself. So, seriously wounded, Kelly lay in the bush for most of the night. At dawn, and that was about 7 a.m, dressed in his armour and armed with 3 handguns, he came out of the bush and attacked the police from the rear. Eyewitnesses variously compared the figure moving in the early morning mist to a bunyip, the devil, and a ghost, as they briefly mentioned before. Journalist Tom Carrington would go on to write the following: with steam rising from the ground, it looked for all the world like the ghost of Hamlet's father with no head, only a very long, thick neck. It was the most extraordinary sight I ever saw or read of in my life, and I felt fairly spellbound with wonder, and I could not stir or speak. And you have to think, emotions would have been running high, they would have been on high alert, and it's just coming on to dawn, and the sun's obviously hitting the cold ground, and the mist is rising, and then from the mist emerges this figure, because he wouldn't have been immediately seen clearly that this was his armour. It just would have looked like the ghost of Hamlet's father without a head. So, yeah, some things I find hard to imagine, but that, I guess me being me, I can just imagine this extraordinary sight of Ned Kelly emerging from the mist in this armour and just coming towards them. It would have been a sight to behold, I'm pretty sure. So police returned fire as Kelly moved toward the hotel, staggering from his injuries and the weight of his armour and the impact of the bullets on the plate iron, which he later described as like blows from a man's fist. Kelly had difficulty aiming, firing and reloading his weapons due to his injuries and his limited vision through the helmet. So the gun battle would last under half an hour, Dan and Hart providing intermittent covering fire from the hotel. And that would be until Steele brought down Ned with 2 shotgun blasts to his unprotected legs and thighs. Ned was disarmed and carried to the railway station where a doctor attended his injuries. He was later found to have more than 28 wounds, including serious gunshot wounds to his left elbow and right foot, multiple less serious gunshot wounds, cuts and abrasions from his own armour. So Ned actually survived being wounded like this, so that's pretty amazing in itself. In the meantime, the siege continued. Around 10 a.m, a ceasefire was called and the remaining 30 hostages left the hotel. The police ordered the hostages to lie down and they were checked to ensure that there were no outlaws hiding amongst them. 2 of the hostages were arrested from being known Kelly sympathisers. By Monday afternoon, a crowd of some 600 spectators had gathered at Glenrowan, and Dan and Hart had ceased shooting. Unwilling to allow his men to storm the hotel, Sadleir ordered a cannon to be sent to blast out the outlaws, but then decided to burn them out. At 2:50 p.m, Senior Constable Charles Johnson, supported by covering fire from the police, set fire to the Glenrowan Inn. Matthew Gibney, a Catholic priest, entered the building in an attempt to rescue anyone inside and discovered the bodies of Byrne, Dan and Hart. The exact circumstances of the deaths of Dan and Hart remain a mystery to this day. Police recovered the body of Byrne from the hotel bar and rescued the seriously wounded hostage Martin Cherry from the kitchen behind the hotel, but unfortunately he would die soon after. After the fire died out at about 4 p.m, the police recovered the badly burnt bodies of Dan Kelly and Hart. In total, the death toll at Glen Rowan included 3 members of the Kelly gang and the hostages Cherry, John Jones, who died the following day at Wangaratta Hospital, and George Metcalf, who died from his gunshot wounds several months later. Jones's sister Jane received a head wound during the siege from a stray bullet and 2 years later died from a lung infection her mother believed was hastened by the injury. Others wounded were hostages Michael Reardon and his baby sister Bridget, who was grazed by a bullet, Superintendent Hare, and one of the Aboriginal troopers. The following day, the police tied Burns' body to the door of the Benalla lockup to be photographed. His friends asked for the body, but the police instead arranged a hasty inquiry and burial in a pauper's grave in Benalla Cemetery. The charred remains of Dan Kelly and Hart were taken to Greta and buried by their families in unmarked graves in the local cemetery. So now we move on to the last part of our segment today on Ned Kelly, and that is his subsequent trial and execution. So as I said before, Kelly would survive his wounds to stand trial on the 19th of October 1880 in Melbourne before Sir Redmond Barry, the judge who had earlier sentenced Kelly's mother to 3 years in prison for the attempted murder of Fitzpatrick. Charles Smythe and Arthur Cholmondeley appeared for the Crown, and the novice barrister Henry Bindon for the prisoner. Kelly was presented on the charges of murdering Constables Lonergan and Scanlon, but was never charged with the murder of Sergeant Kennedy. The trial was adjourned to the 28th of October, and the prosecution chose not to proceed with the charge of Scanlon's murder. Ned Kelly was convicted of the willful murder of Lonergan and sentenced to death by hanging. After handing down the sentence, Barry concluded with the customary words, "May God have mercy on your soul." To which Kelly replied, "I will go a little further than that and say I will see you there when I go." Barry was to die of natural causes only 12 days after Ned Kelly's execution. On the 3rd of November, the Executive Council of Victoria decided that Ned was to be hanged 8 days later, the 11th of November, at the Old Melbourne Jail. In the week leading up to the execution, thousands turned out at street rallies across Melbourne demanding reprieve for Kelly. And on the 8th of November, a petition for clemency with over 32,000 signatures, some of which were of a suspicious nature, were presented to the Governor's private secretary. The Executive Council announced soon after that yes, the hanging would proceed as scheduled despite the pleas from the public not to execute Ned Kelly. The day before his execution, Kelly had his photographic portrait taken as a keepsake for his family. He was granted farewell interviews with his relatives. One newspaper reported that his mother's last words for him were, "Mind you die like a Kelly." But Joneses and Castles have questioned this. The following morning, John Castigo, the governor of the jail, informed Kelly that the hour of execution had been fixed at 10 a.m. Kelly's leg irons were removed, and at 9 a.m. he was led out by warders accompanied by the chaplain Dean Donaghy. When passing the jail's garden, he commented on the beauty of the flowers. That makes me a little sad, like he was going to his death, but he still had time to appreciate how beautiful the flowers in the garden were. Accounts differ to Kelly's last words. Some newspapers wrote that it was as follows, "Such is life," while other newspapers recorded that this was his response when Castigo told him of the intended hour of the execution earlier that day. The Argus wrote that Kelly's last words were, "Ah, well, I suppose it has to come to this," as the rope was placed around his neck. According to another account, Kelly intended to make a speech, but instead made no audible sound. The warden later wrote that Kelly, when prompted to say his last words, mumbled something indiscernible. And that is where the life of Ned Kelly ends, with his execution that day. But Ned Kelly's armour is on display in the State Library of Victoria. The helmet, breastplate, backplate and shoulder plates show 18 bullet marks. Also on display are Kelly's Snyder Enfield rifle and one of his boots. So after Ned's death, the Royal Commission into the police conduct during the Kelly outbreak resulted in many force members being censured, reprimanded, demoted, suspended or dismissed. In March 1881, the Victorian government approved a Royal Commission into the conduct of the Victorian police during the Kelly outbreak. Over the next 6 months, the commission, chaired by Francis Longmore, held 66 meetings, examined 62 witnesses and visited towns throughout Kelly country, as it came to be known. While its report found that the police had acted properly in relation to the criminality of the Kellys, it exposed widespread corruption and ended a number of police careers, including that of Chief Commissioner Standish. Numerous other officers, including senior staff, were reprimanded, demoted or suspended. It concluded with a list of 36 recommendations to reform. Ned Kelly hoped that his death would lead to an investigation into police conduct, and although the report did not exonerate him or his gangs, its findings were said to strip the authorities of what scanty rags of reputation the Kellys had left them. The £8,000 reward money was divided among various claimants, with £6,000 going to members of the Victorian Police. Superintendent Hare receiving the lion's share of £8,000, Curnow complained about his payout of £550, and the following year it was upgraded to £1,000. 7 Aboriginal trackers involved in the siege were each rewarded £50. But their money was given to the Victorian and Queensland governments for safekeeping, which hardly seems fair to me. The reward board's argument being it would not be desirable to place any considerable sum of money in the hands of persons unable to use it. Which that's kind of shitty, because I'm sure that those trackers deserved a heck of a lot more than £50 for their participation in the raids, and I'm pretty sure they would have been able to find a way to use that money. There was media and police speculation that there would be further outbreaks of violence in northeastern Victoria following Kelly's execution. Jones and Dawson argued that changes in policing methods reduced this threat. The police held informal discussions with the Kelly family to assure them they would be treated fairly if they kept the peace. The police no longer pursued a policy of dispersing the family and their sympathisers by denying them land in northeastern Victoria, but rather explicitly tied access land to lawful behaviour. During the Royal Commission, there were threats of violence and intimidation against people who had assisted the police. Nevertheless, the police reported a reduction in horse and cattle theft and crime in general in the region following Kelly's death. Kelly's mother was released from prison in February 1881. Jones stated that she met with Greta Constable Robert Graham soon after, and they reached an understanding which helped reduce the tension in the community. So Mrs. Kelly would die aged 95 on the 27th of March 1923. In line with the practice of the day, no records were kept regarding the disposal of an executed person's remains. Kelly was buried in the Old Men's Yard just inside the walls of Old Melbourne Jail. In 1929, the Old Melbourne Jail was closed for routine demolition, and the bodies in its graveyard were uncovered during the demolition works. During the recovery of the bodies, spectators and workers stole skeletal parts and skulls from a number of the graves. That's very disrespectful. That's like desecration, including one marked with an arrow and the initials EK, in the belief they belonged to Kelly. The EK-marked grave was situated by itself on the opposite side of the yard where the rest of the graveyard was situated. The site foreman, Harry Franklin, retrieved the skull from the EK-marked grave and gave it to the police, as no provision had been made for the disposal of the remains. Franklin had the bodies reburied in Pentridge Prison at his own expense. And what a nice thing of him to do. The skull from the EK-marked grave, which had been stored at the Victorian Penal Department, was taken to Canberra for research by Sir Colin Mackenzie, the first director of the Australian Institute of Anatomy in 1934. For a period of time it was lost, but it was later found while cleaning out an old safe in 1952. In 1972, the skull was put on display at the Old Melbourne Jail until it was stolen again on the 12th of December 1978. An investigation in 2010 proved that the displayed skull was in fact the one recovered in 1929. Historical and forensic investigation of the remains on March 2008, it was announced that Australian archaeologists believed that they had found Kelly's grave on the site of Pentridge Prison. The bones were uncovered at a mass grave, and Kelly's were among those of 32 felons who had been executed by hanging. Jeremy Smith, a senior archaeologist with the Heritage Victoria, said, "We believe we have conclusively found the burial site, but that is very different from finding the remains." Ellen Hollow, Kelly's then 62-year-old grandniece, offered to supply her own DNA to help identify Ned Kelly's remains. On the anniversary of Kelly's hanging, 11th of November 2009, Tom Baxter handed the skull in his possession to police. It was historically and forensically tested along with the Pentridge remains. The skull was compared to the cast of the skull that had been stolen from the Old Melbourne Jail in 1978, and it did prove to be a match. The skull was then compared to that in a newspaper photograph of worker Alex Talbot holding the skull recovered in 1929, which also showed a close resemblance. Talbot was known to have taken a tooth from the skull as a souvenir, and a media campaign to find the whereabouts of the tooth led to Talbot's grandson coming forward. The tooth was found to belong to the skull, confirming it was indeed the skull recovered in 1929. In 2004, before the skull was handed to police, a cast of the skull was made and compared to the death masks of those executed at Old Melbourne Jail, which eliminated all but two. The two were those of Ned Kelly and Ernest Knox, who had been executed in March 1894. Headstone marked EK 19394 and buried near Frederick Deeming. Headstone marked with the initials AW and a D underneath. In April 1929, the skulls of the EK marked grave, which was thought at the time to belong to Kelly and Deeming, were looted from the excavated graves. The death mask of Knox and a facial reconstruction of a cast of the skull were a close match. In 2010 and 2011, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine performed a series of craniofacial superimposition, CT scanning, anthropology and DNA tests on the skull recovered from the EK grave, and sadly it was concluded that it was not in fact Ned Kelly's skull. In 2014, the remains of Deeming's brother were exhumed from Bebington Cemetery and tissue samples were obtained from a femur bone. A DNA profile was successfully obtained from the samples and compared with the DNA profile that had been previously obtained from the skull that was stolen from Old Melbourne Jail. But the DNA profiles did not match, conclusively proving that the skull is also not Deeming's. It is now accepted that the skull recovered in 1929 and later displayed in the Old Melbourne Jail was not Kelly's or Deeming's. Forensic pathologists also examined the bones from Pentridge, which were much decayed and jumbled with the remains of others, and that made identification extremely difficult. The collarbone was found to be the only bone that had survived in all the skeletons, and these were all DNA tested against that of Lee Oliver. A match to Kelly was found, and the associated skeleton turned out to be one of the most complete. Kelly's remains were additionally identified by a partially healed right foot, right knee and left elbow injuries matching those caused by the bullet wounds at Glenrowan, as recorded by the jail surgeon in 1880, and by the fact that his head was missing, likely removed for a phrenological study. A section from the back of the skull, the occipital, was recovered from the grave that bore saw cuts that matched those present on several neck vertebrae, indicating the skull section belonged to the skeleton and that an illegal dissection had been performed. Poor Ned. In August 2011, scientists publicly confirmed a skeleton exhumed from the old Pentridge Prison mass graveyard was indeed that of our Ned Kelly. After comparing the DNA to that of his great-great-great-niece, Lee Oliver, the DNA matching was based on mitochondrial DNA, HV1, HV2. This is indicative of Kelly's maternal line. This is so interesting. And I have to say, I absolutely love forensics. Don't think me weird, but I do. Investigating forensic pathologists had indicated that no adequate quality somatic DNA was obtained that would enable a Y-DNA profile to be determined. This may be attempted at a later date. A Y-DNA profile would enable Kelly's paternal genetic genealogy to be determined with reference to the data already existing in the Kelly Y-DNA study. The skeleton was missing most of its skull, the whereabouts of which are still unknown. On August 1, 2012, the Victorian government issued a licence for Kelly's bones to be returned to the Kelly family, who made plans for his final burial. The family also appealed for the person who possessed Kelly's skull to return it. The 20th of January 2013, Kelly's relatives granted his final wish and buried his remains in a consecrated ground at Greta Cemetery, near his mother's unmarked grave. A piece of Kelly's skull was also buried with his remains and was surrounded by concrete to prevent looting. The burial followed a requiem mass held on the 18th of January 2013 at St Patrick's Catholic Church in Wangaratta. During the Great Depression, the Bayside City Council built blue stone walls to protect local beaches from erosion. The stones were taken from the outer walls of the old Melbourne jail and included the headstones of those executed and buried on the grounds, including Kelly's. Most, including Kelly's, were placed with the engravings, initials and date of execution facing inwards. Kelly is often seen as the embodiment of characteristics thought to be typically Australian, such as defying authority, siding with the underdog, and fighting bravely for one's beliefs. According to Ian Jones, after Kelly's death, a Robin Hood-like figure survived. Good-looking, brave, a fine horseman, a bushman and a crack shot, devoted to his mothers and sisters, a man who treated all women with courtesy, who stole from the rich to give to the poor, who dressed himself in his enemy's uniform to outwit him. Most of all, a man who stood against the police persecutors of his family and was driven to become an outlaw when he defended his sister against a drunken constable. Such was Ned Kelly, the myth. Seal states that Kelly was aware of the tradition of the bushranger hero and attempted to live up to the myth. The Euroa and Jerilderie raids were partly public performances where the Kelly gang acted courteously to women, burned mortgage documents, and entertained their hostages. By the time Kelly was outlawed, the bushranger was an anachronism. Australia was highly urbanised, the telegraph and the railway were rapidly connecting the bush to the city, and Kelly was already an icon for a romanticised past. That is where we leave the story of Ned Kelly. Be him a cop killer, an icon, a hero, you decide. I like to think myself of Ned Kelly as a hero because we don't actually know how much police corruption was involved with the harassment of his family. And I think Ned just got to that point. He just had enough, and especially with what they did to his mother, I think that was probably the straw that broke Ned Kelly's back. And the fact that constable had allegedly become handsy with his sisters. I could see how that would enrage Ned Kelly, that he would want to defend the women of his family. So, what do you guys think? What did you think of Ned Kelly? Have you heard of him before? Is this the first time you've heard of him? Please let me know what you think of our Ned in the comments section below. And as always, because I forgot to do this at the start of the video, I was just so excited to tell you about Ned Kelly. Can I ask, if you are not already subscribed to the channel, to please consider subscribing to us. We are still trying to get to our first 1,000 subscribers. So if you guys could help us with that, that would be amazing. All you have to do is press the subscribe button, press the little bell next to it so that you never miss a video, and like, comment and share, because it helps us out a ton and it gets us a little bit further along in our goals to reach 1,000 subscribers and being able to join the partnership program, which means an income for me, which means I can make better videos for you guys. Anyway, thank you all so much for sitting and listening to the tale of our Ned Kelly. Yeah, I have to say, I love him. I love Ned Kelly, I always have. I remember my nana was the first one to kind of tell me about Ned and all the stories, and there was something zooming around behind me again just there. Did you guys see it? I mean, it's winter here in Australia at the moment, so I'm doubting it's a bug, but I'm not really sure exactly what it is. And I haven't had any bugs or anything bothering me in here, so I'm beginning to think it might be possibly a fairy. Who knows? But there's something in here. I'm going to have to figure out what this is sooner or later. And speaking of the paranormal, we have our next Clarence Valley Paranormal Research day on Sunday. We are going to another spooky location, so please stay tuned for that. And we are still waiting to hear on news from our first location that we wanted to do before the one we're going to on Sunday. They met yesterday to have a meeting as to whether they would allow us to film at the location or not. So I'm still waiting on news of that. As soon as I know, I will let you guys know. Hopefully it's going to be a yes, but if it's a no, that's okay. It's understandable. A lot of people aren't comfortable with the paranormal or investigators or filming. So it's all okay. We have got just a huge list of locations that we want to go to. So please stay tuned for all of that. And as always, please stay safe, everybody. Look after yourselves. In Australia, stay warm. It's still very cold over here. We're not quite into August yet, so it's still cold, but by the end of August we should be starting to warm up a bit, and that'll be really nice. Yeah, so I love you guys all so much, and thank you so much for my constant subscribers, my new subscribers, and my subscribers that like to chat to me about the cases. That's one of the best parts of the job. So stay safe, everybody. Hope you enjoyed Ned Kelly, and I will see you all again soon. Bye.